Okay, let's have a look at the poem Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. We are prepared. We build our houses squat, sink walls in rock and roof them with good slate. This wizened earth has never troubled us with hay, so, as you see, there are no stacks or stooks that can be lost. Nor are there trees which might prove company when it blows full blast. You know what I mean. Leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus in a gale so that you can listen to the thing you fear, forgetting that it pummels your house too. But there are no trees, no natural shelter. You might think that the sea is company, exploding comfortably down on the cliffs. But no. When it begins, the flung spray hits the very windows, spits like a tame cat turned savage. We just sit tight while wind dives and strafes invisibly. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded by the empty air. Strange. It is a huge nothing that we fear. This poem is mostly about the power of nature, but also the power of people to resist the onslaught of wind and rain, despite the barren and isolated location. And Heaney uses 3 of the 4 classical elements in this poem, earth, air and water, to describe not only the storm, but also the island's resistance to it. Heaney begins the poem in confident tone. He says, "We are prepared." And the next few lines explain what the islanders have done to limit the impact of the storm. And these preparations seem to suggest that the conflict between the islanders and the weather has been going on for generations, since they've had to adapt building techniques to limit its impact. They build their houses low to the ground and sink the walls in rock for greater stability. So we have the words squat, sink and slate, which are the 3 ways in which the islanders are able to prepare themselves for the storm. And this alliteration creates a sort of hissing sound like the rushing wind. And in the next line, Heaney personifies the earth using the word wizened here to make it seem old and shriveled, as if all the goodness from the soil has long since dried up, making crops like hay impossible to grow. But Heaney shows how this is an advantage for the people, as they are not tempted to thatch their roofs. The words stacks and stooks here are both references to hay, but instead they build them with good slate. And this personification of the earth shows how both the men and the island are battling against the weather. Throughout this poem, Heaney uses a sort of calm, relaxed, conversational style. And this is partly created through the use of casual asides, like here, so as you see. And he invites us here to view the houses and admire them for their rugged practicality. Another way that Heaney does this is through the use of enjambment, which is where you have lines of poetry that don't have any punctuation at the end. I mean, look at this. We've got stacks, trees, full, branches, gales, and could go on. And all of this also contributes to the chatty style of the poem. And the final way that Heaney achieves this is by writing the poem using iambic pentameter, which means that each of the lines have approximately 10 syllables, with the emphasis falling on every other syllable, and it's felt that this is the best way to replicate the way that people speak. Now, along with the lack of hay, there is also a lack of trees, which further adds to our impression of a fairly barren environment. Heaney writes that these trees might prove company when the storm begins. But their absence is, again, presented as a relief, since if there had been trees nearby, they would raise a tragic chorus, a great piece of personification which suggests that mournful, wailing noise likely to inspire fear which the islanders do not have to endure. The poet uses sound to suggest the power of the gale here, in particular by using combinations of plosives such as blows, full, blast, but also the word pummels. And there are other examples of alliteration too. The repetition of the S noise, for example, at the beginning of the poem, here with squat, sink, swalls, slate, etc., technically sibilants. And this, along with the fricatives, which is this F noise here, help to suggest the noise of the storm. After this point, there is a change of tone indicated by the word but that I've highlighted here. And now the poet seems to stop seeing the lack of natural resources as an advantage and addresses the bleakness of the situation. The word no is repeated several times in this section of the poem. We've got no trees, no shelter, but no, along with the word nothing in the final line, which reinforces this negative tone. Another thing which is worth pointing out is the word company, which I've highlighted here, and that's repeated twice in this poem. And in both occasions, it's the absence of company which is addressed. In the first instance, it was the absence of wailing trees, while in the second time, it's the sea which provides no company. The poet says, "You might think, but no." And this repetition may further our understanding of this community, whose isolation is also contributed to by virtue of being on an island, literally cut off from other people. Now, an oxymoron is a deliberate contradiction, and here we have exploding comfortably, which carries a number of different possible meanings. Perhaps the frequency of this type of weather means that despite its violence, there is something reassuringly familiar about it. Perhaps the islanders are comfortable because they're protected from the worst of the weather by the natural barrier of the cliffs. Whichever interpretation you prefer, it's useful to note the use of the word exploding, which is the first of a sequence of images here linked with military combat, which dominate the end of this poem. One of the features of Heaney's poetic style in this poem is the way in which he takes typically benign, harmless images such as the sea or cats, for example, and turns them into wild and savage creatures. And perhaps this is challenging the idea that living on an island is an idyllic existence. In this part of the poem, for example, a simile is used to compare the spray thrown up by the waves to the hissing of a tamed cat turned savage. It is in the final 4 lines of the poem where we have this extended metaphor of military combat that I was alluding to earlier, and this is mostly carried through the allusion to a fighter plane attacking the island, which is used to describe the power of the wind. Firstly, as I've highlighted here, the wind is said to dive, so that means come on the island at a slow trajectory. The words here, strafe and salvo, both refer to the repeated machine gun fire from a low-flying aircraft, while bombarded here just means to be attacked continuously by bombs, shells or missiles. But what's really interesting is the juxtaposition of these words with images of emptiness. The wind, for example, dives invisibly. It is space which is a salvo, and they are being bombarded by empty air. And this leads Heaney to a quite contemplative mood at the end of the poem as he reflects on how strange it is that it is a huge nothing that they are afraid of. And this has led some people to interpret the poem as being about faith, that perhaps it's God which is the huge nothing that people fear. And I'm not sure whether I agree with this or not. I am more of the view that Heaney is continuing his description of the island as being so featureless that there is simply no evidence of the power of the storm. But if you're thinking about this poem with the theme of power in mind, then quite a good question to try and answer is this. How is the storm shown to have power over the islanders? And in the same way, you can think about how it is that the islanders are shown to have power over the storm, because both of these ideas are expressed in the poem. The fact that all the islanders can do is sit tight while the storm is raging might indicate that they are powerless, while their preparation at the start and the island's natural defences might suggest that it's the people who in fact have more power. Another interpretation, which takes the poem in a completely metaphorical direction, uses the first 8 lines of the title, S-T-O-R-M-O-N-T, to create the word Stormont, which is the seat of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And this part of the world has certainly had to weather its own political storms in its history.